Well, we all go through trials, right? And especially many of us during this period can really understand and agree that there are trials in life. This COVID-19 situation really brought that to the forefront, and so during trials, one of God's wills is for us to be there for each other. God created us for community. It was the first message of our series in friendship about the basis for friendship, and it's because God created us to be in community, created us to relate and have relationships with one another. We know this, and many of us who have been, especially early on during this pandemic as society was shut down and we have had to isolate from one another, we realize that we really need community. And we really miss being with one another. Normally, we would be having barbecues during the summer. We'd be doing stuff with one another, and a lot of those things are limited right now. And so it's a trial. We understand this. And so when we're going through trials in our lives, when we're going through difficulties, then it's imperative that we are there for each other. And a lot of times, it is the way that God comforts us during trials is through other people. Is when Christ is manifested through His people, and I as a friend can be Christ to the person who is undergoing trials. And so this is important. This is an important aspect of friendship. I've been fortunate to have friends in my life who have really come alongside me, and I have been able to lay my heart out, and they've been able to bear the burdens with me that I have carried. And so that's what we're going to talk about this morning, is the aspect of friendship involving trials and how we can be a good friend in comforting others. And so we turn to the book of Job, the go-to book regarding trials and difficulties. And we're not going to go through the whole book, but we're going to go through selected passages from Job. And so I'm going to read for us the first couple of chapters to give us kind of a background to set up the situation as we see it. So I will do my best in reading this. It'll be a long passage, but we'll go through it. In the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of fasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, well, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." That's my envisioning of Satan's voice here. Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power. But on the man himself, do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now one day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job. and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword. I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." Now while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept them off on the camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger, a fourth one, came and said, "Your sons and daughters are feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house," when all of a sudden, a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Well, at this, Job got up and tore his robe. He shaved his head. He fell to the ground in worship and said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. In chapter 2, now on another day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life, but now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, Are you still maintaining your integrity?" That's my best woman voice. "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. When Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Man, this is, if you think you've had a bad day, just read Job, and you will see that this is pretty severe. I mean, Job was a righteous man. According to God, he was upright and righteous. And not only did he have all his possessions taken away from him, just one day, boom, everything he owned was taken away from him. All of his children were taken away from him. They all died in a freak accident. And then his own health was taken away from him. Seemingly within a short period of time. I mean, that's all he had left was his life, basically. And it wasn't even in good quality. And so what we see at the end of chapter 2 here is that his 3 friends come. And for about a week, it says, about 7 days, they stayed with him to sympathize with him. And it begins well. And they're just there. And as we look at the rest of Job, most of the book of Job is conversation. It's a dialogue between Job and his friends. And they go back and forth, until the end when God finally speaks. But as we look at various passages in the book of Job, we're going to look at 14 principles of being a friend during trials. 14 principles of being a friend during trials. Okay, that's a lot of principles. We're going to go through them real quick. And what I'll ask you to do is to pick maybe 3 that you relate to, that really speak to you. Some of these maybe you're an expert on. You're like, I'm naturally this way anyways. And there may be some principles that we address this morning, maybe we can have a little bit more work on. So, 14 principles for being a friend during trials. The first one is be silent. Be silent and listen. Be silent and listen. Now, in chapter 2, at the end there, in verse 13, it says, "Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was." They just sat with him. And a lot of times that's what our friends need. That's what our friends need. If we're a good friend, we may have an inclination to want to help them to solve their problem and to be active in doing something. But sometimes, maybe a lot of times, they just need a caring person there with them. And just to sit, not necessarily say anything. And so it's good for us to practice silence and listening, just waiting for the other person to talk. I can't imagine, what I would even say to someone who lost everything that they had. All their possessions, the worldly possessions, were gone. Their children, all 10 of them, had died in one accident, and then the health declining. That's a lot. Honestly, I don't even know what I would say. And that's fine. I think that's fine. We don't ask. Nothing we say really is going to change the situation anyways, right? And so just to be there with them and to listen. That is, be silent and listen. Number 1 principle. Second one is when your friend is going through a trial, don't accuse them of anything. Don't accuse. Well, we fast forward to chapter 4. Verse 1, it says, so the situation is silent, but after a week of sitting there, Job finally speaks. He finally says something. So let's go back to chapter 3. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived." I imagine him saying this sarcastically. Like, yay, whatever. Curse that day I was born, he says. That day, may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. May gloom and utter darkness claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. This is pretty depressing here. He's like cursing his birthday, the day of his birth. And he says all of this negative stuff. He goes on for the whole chapter. In verse 11, it says, "Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Why were there knees to receive me?" It goes on and on. Then Eliphaz the Temanite in chapter 4. So the first reply, they hear all this. The first friend to speak, he says, "If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled, yes, strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed." Eliphaz essentially says, you've given a lot of good advice to your friends and people, and now something bad happens to you, and you're all discouraged. Well, duh! If that kind of tragedy doesn't discourage you, you are not human. Right? I don't know of anybody, I don't care how faithful you are. Tragedy happens in your life, there is some discouragement, especially at the level of Job, who lost everything he had. Job's response in chapter 3 is natural. It's normal for a human being to respond that way. And Eliphaz, his response was to accuse Job of being discouraged. Well, of course, because he was discouraged. Instead of empathizing with him, he makes an assumption, he makes a judgment, and he accuses Job. And the result of what Eliphaz says, it's in chapters 4 and 5. The result of this, now it's Job's turn to respond, and he speaks in chapter 6. He says, Job replied, "Well, if only my anguish could be weighed, and all of my misery be placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand on the seas. No wonder my words have been impetuous. The arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me." Job is not helped by Eliphaz's response. It's not helpful. Eliphaz may have said correct things. Job was discouraged. He also said, Eliphaz, going back to chapter 4, verse 7, he says, "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed?" He brings this theology of righteousness to Job. That's not what Job needed at the time. He didn't need a theology of righteousness. Who ever being innocent has ever perished? If you're innocent, if you've done good things, you won't perish. That was Eliphaz's theology of righteousness, or his theology of suffering. It's like, if you haven't done anything bad, nothing bad's going to happen to you. If you're a good person, only good things are going to happen to you, which is completely false. Completely false. A lot of good people to whom bad things happen. Imagine the Apostle Paul being in prison because he had preached the gospel. Or he was compelled to preach the gospel, and so he does a good thing, and as a result, he is thrown into prison in very horrible conditions. And imagine his ministry partners come to visit him in prison, and they say, "Well, it's your own fault for preaching the gospel. I mean, you knew the results of it, right? You took your chances, and so..." Imagine if they said that to him. What a beep. There are some words there that you might use to describe this friend, this insensitive friend. It's true, what he says is true, but it's not helpful. And so, second principle, don't accuse. Maybe your friend is going through a trial because of their actions. There may not necessarily be bad actions, but whatever it is. During this time, let's just say, for example, they went to eat at a restaurant because now indoor restaurants are permitted. They're reopened here in Ontario. Let's just say they went and calculated the risk, but then let's just say they got contracted with COVID-19. As a friend, it is not helpful for us to say, "Well, you shouldn't have gone to the restaurant." Number 3, don't guilt trip. Don't guilt trip. Still in chapter 4, Eliphaz, chapter 4, verse 6, Eliphaz says, "Should not piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope?" Basically, he says, hey, your faith should carry you. Why are you discouraged? Don't you have any faith? Don't you have any piety? Shouldn't that be your confidence? I understand what Eliphaz is saying here. He was probably hurting for Job too. It's an assumption. But it's not helpful. It's in some ways a guilt trip. You're guilting the other person for not having enough faith during this time. And that is not helpful. Person is already feeling bad. It's not helpful to make them feel worse. Fourth principle, don't minimize. Don't minimize their pain. In Job 8, now it's his second friend, Bildad's turn to speak. He gets a chance. In chapter 8, verse 5, it says, Bildad, well, let's begin at verse 1, Job 8:1. Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, "How long will you say such things? Job, stop talking." He says, "Your words are a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin." Man, that's harsh. He said, your children deserve this because they sinned. So, should you be upset with that? Verse 5, he says, "But if you seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state." That's minimizing the situation. Job, if you only do what is right, if you only shape up, God's going to restore everything you had before. That is a very minimizing, simplistic way of viewing the situation. Not all trials that we face are because of our own actions. Some trials are something that has just come upon us, partly because we live in a fallen world, partly for other reasons, partly there's a mystery of God's will that is at work, and we don't know everything involved in God's will. But the world doesn't revolve around us, right? Around me as individuals, contrary to what narcissists think. And so we are part of something greater, and sometimes these things happen to us, but to minimize it is not helpful. And to spiritualize it is not helpful either. There's a way we can say certain comforting things, but this is not the way. If you seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you're pure and upright, even more, he will rouse himself on your behalf. He'll restore you to your prosperous state. Life is not that simple. So don't minimize. Number 5, a lot of don'ts. Let's go back to do's. Encourage them. That is probably our main job as a friend who's going through a trial, is to lift them up. They're down low. Our job is to lift them up, encourage them. So in the next verse, chapter 8, verse 7, Eliphaz says something actually helpful. Your beginnings will seem humble, so prosperous will your future be. Now, in the context, this is still kind of a simplistic statement, but it is an encouragement. It's an encouragement that, hey, this is not going to last forever. This is not going to continue on for the rest of your life. COVID-19 is not going to last forever. It seems like it. It seems like an eternity. Remember when it first started in March? Right? March 11th was the day that it was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, and things kind of shut down immediately. And we thought, okay, 2 weeks, and it'll be over. 5 months later, we're like, okay, maybe in 2 more weeks. But you know what? This is not going to last forever. We're not going to have to practice physical distancing forever. There will be a day when we get to hug one another. Even here in church, we can have our greeting time back. We can have our hands-shaking contest again. There'll be a day when we can be indoors without masks. We can be here at church without masks. We can sing our hearts out, sing loudly, not caring. I mean, I look forward to that day when we can all be here in church and everybody is able to sing loudly, and I imagine that will be the loudest this church has ever been. Because we can. It's not going to last forever. And the trials that we face in our lives won't last forever. And that is something that we can encourage our friend with. At least that truth is something we can encourage them with. There are a lot of other encouraging words that we can share with our friends. And instead of thinking about accusing or giving a guilt trip or minimizing or spiritualizing, we can think if we need to say anything, we can think of things to encourage them with. Number 6, along these lines, don't try to be right. Don't try to be right. When a person is going through hardships and difficulties, when they're in pain, when they're suffering, there are a lot of things that come out of our mouths, right? That we don't necessarily mean, and some of these things could be irrational, or they might not make sense. And that's fine, because when we're in a highly emotional state, that takes over. And so we may say things that don't make sense. Maybe untrue even, but that's how we feel. And as it is very tempting as a person hearing these things, as a friend, it's very tempting to correct what they say. And this is especially true, I find, in conservative circles with conservative theology, to want to correct bad theology. There's a time and a place for that, right? And when your friend is suffering, that is not the time or the place to correct their theology. In chapter 11, fast forwarding, chapter 11, we have Zophar, the third friend, speak. Verse 1, then Zophar, the Naamathite, replied, are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker, Job? He doesn't even call him Job, he calls him this talker. Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce others to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock? You say to God, my beliefs are flawless and I am prayer in your sight. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, so that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. Continues on and on. He hears Job and he disagrees with what Job says. He says, is anyone going to just let him talk? And the answer to that is, yeah, you're going to let him talk because he's in a lot of pain. He probably doesn't mean everything that he's saying. Maybe. And what Job says isn't necessarily all that wrong either. But they get into, it's just interesting because it gets into this battle of theology. And they're debating theology as a result of Job's suffering. Don't try to be right. That is not the time and place. You can have a conversation later when the person isn't suffering. Say, well, maybe a few weeks later or whatever, bookmark it in your mind. So, you said something, I'm just wondering what you meant by that. And just clarify. So 6, don't try to be right. 7, don't belittle the other person. Don't belittle the other person. Now, in chapter 12, after Zophar, buddy Zophar, speaks, Job replied, doubtless you are the only people who matter, and wisdom will die with you. But I have a mind as well as you. I am not inferior to you, who does not know all these things. I have become a laughingstock to my friends, although I called on God, and he answered, a mere laughingstock, though righteous and blameless. He feels like he has been belittled. And then in chapter 13, Job continues talking. He says, my eyes have seen all this, my ears have heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I'm not inferior to you, but I desire to speak to the Almighty to argue my case with God. Job is defensive here. He has to defend himself because his friends have become accusers. And they're accusing him of bad theology. And Job feels belittled. Don't belittle our friends. They're going through trial and suffering. It's along the lines of accusing. We don't have to accuse or belittle them. Number 8, comfort. Another positive one. Our job is to encourage and also to comfort our friends. In chapter 16, fast forward there. Job replied, I have heard many things like this. You are miserable comforters, all of you. Job has had enough. He just says it straight up. You guys are miserable comforters, all of you. Well, your long-winded speeches never end. Stop talking, guys. He said, what ails you that you keep on arguing? Why do you keep arguing with me? You guys are the worst. Miserable comforters. Literally, it's comforters of trouble. Comforters characterized by trouble. They are giving Job more trouble than what he has experienced already. They weren't really comforting. They were causing more grief and more trouble. If you find yourself doing that to your friend, best thing we can do is just to stop talking, pause, take a breath, and go back to the first principle. Be silent and listen. Number 8, don't be critical. Not a time to be critical. In chapter 18, we have Bildad speaking again. Bildad the Shuhite replied, when will ye end these speeches? Be sensible, and then we can talk. Why are we regarded as cattle and considered stupid in your sight? Bildad is critical of Job, the way he was handling the situation. Be sensible, he says. Come on, think straightly. Well, how can you if you're undergoing such pain and suffering? It is not the time to be cerebral with our friends. What they usually need is emotional sympathy. Emotional sympathy. What they need is a caring friend. Sympathy, its root meaning, its etymological meaning, is to feel with somebody. When you're sympathizing with somebody, you're feeling what they're feeling. So when your friend is crying and you cry with them, it's because you're feeling what they're feeling. You're taking their burden away and you're sharing their burden with them. I remember one time when I was going through some trials and I was sitting with a friend and I could see tears coming from their eyes. I could see their tears watering up. And he was trying not to cry too much, just like, but I could see that. And it was as if some of the weight was lifted off of me. I felt the weight lifted off of me a bit. Just seeing my friend with tears in his eyes because of what I was saying. That's what sympathy is. Number 10 is don't get defensive. Don't get defensive. Same chapter, 18, verse 3. Why are we regarded as cattle and considered stupid in your sight? Bildad gets defensive here because Job, they're going back and forth. And Bildad's like, why am I stupid? And the point is, it's not about you, Bildad. It's not about you, Zophar. It's not about you. The other guy, what's the other guy's name? Okay, it doesn't matter. Right? It's not about them. It's about Job right now. Job, you're the one in suffering. You're the one in pain. So let's focus on the friend. I can take a couple hits right now. I'm not the one that lost my whole family. I'm not the one that lost everything I own. Job is. So, hey, if they say stuff at me, I'm going to take it because I'm your friend. There's no need to be defensive. They may attack me, that's fine, but it's not about you. It's about them and what they're going through. Number 11, don't make them feel worse. See, a lot of these are obvious, right? But we need reminders. Don't make them feel worse. Job 19, Job replied, how long will you torment me and crush me with words? 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. Job felt worse. I don't know what was worse, the actual thing that happened to him, the things that happened to him, or his friends' reactions. A lot of the times, we can be such a friend that we make them feel worse than they actually, and they regret ever telling you about their pain and suffering. Don't be that friend. Don't kick your friend down when he's down already. Don't make them feel worse. Number 12, have confidence in their faith. They are a believer in Christ. Have confidence that God is working on them. In chapter 19, still, verse 25, Job says this, in the midst of all of this, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I know that my Redeemer lives. He says this great truth in the midst of the storm. And I don't think his friends actually acknowledged that. I don't think they said, you know, that's so encouraging to hear, Job. I don't think they respond that way. There is this faith. And we have to remember that God is not only working on me. I am not the only one that God is working on. He is working on all of us who profess faith in him. And so we have to acknowledge that our friend, if they are a believer, that God is working on them, and to encourage them with their faith. To have confidence in them. In 2 Corinthians 7:4, Paul tells the Corinthians, he says, I have great confidence in you. I take great pride in you. I am greatly encouraged in all our troubles. My joy knows no bounds. And then in verse 16, he says, I am glad that I can have complete confidence in you. Paul says this to the Corinthian church, which was one of the most worldly churches in that first century. He says, I can have complete confidence in you, of your faith, that I know that God is going to work on you and work in you, that you will not fall. That will lift up your friend. If Job is able to say that, God had a hand upon Job. I know my Redeemer lives. In the end, he will stand on the earth. And even if my flesh fails, in essence, he says, God will never fail. And when someone says that, when they're going through pain and suffering, you got to encourage that person. Number 13, be humble. Be humble. Chapter 32, verse 6. There's a fourth friend here. What happens up until chapter 31 is those friends in Job, those three friends in Job go back and forth. Now, there was a fourth friend who was a bit younger. He was a younger guy, Elihu. And it says in the beginning of chapter 32, these three men stopped answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. But Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was also angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job, and yet they had condemned him. Now Elihu had waited for speaking to Job because they were older than he. But when he saw that the three men had nothing more to say, his anger was aroused. So Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, said, I am young in years, and you are old. That is why I was fearful, not daring to tell you what I know. I thought, age should speak, advanced years should teach wisdom. But it's the spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding. It is not only the old who are wise, not only the aged who understand what is right. Therefore, I say, listen to me. I too will tell you what I know. And he goes on and on. Now, what he says is technically true, right? Just because you're at a certain age doesn't mean you're wise necessarily. Although life experience does tend to bring about wisdom, right? But we know in this life that there are older people who are unwise and younger people who are wise. So what he says is technically true. In the beginning, though, he starts off well. He exhibits humility. He says, well, I'm young. I want to defer to my elders here. I was fearful of speaking. But then he says, but I've had enough. You guys are dumb, basically. You guys weren't able to refute Job. And here's the thing where Elihu misses the point. The point was not to refute Job. Why would you refute a man who's going through pain and suffering? Even though he was saying wrong things. That is not the point. And so, while Elihu began with humility, he quickly lost it. And so it helps us when we're trying to be a friend to someone in need to be humble. And that means not having all the answers, because we don't have all the answers. Elihu should have said, I don't know why this happened to you. I'm sorry for you. I love you. It's probably what he should have said. We have this tendency to want to fix our friends. We have this tendency to try to give answers, to solve problems. Right? Do you know anyone who whenever you tell them, maybe you just want to vent, you're not really looking for a solution, but you just want to vent, and they respond with a solution? You know anyone like that? If you don't know anyone like that, you're that person. And it's like, no, I don't need you to give me a solution. I already know the solution. I'm just expressing my feelings to you. I just want someone to understand me. That's really the thing that people want, someone to understand us. And that's what we as humans, that's really what we need. Someone to understand us. Someone to understand how we're feeling, what we're thinking. And then finally, number 14, we're here. Let God be the judge. Let God be the judge. Technically, we don't have the power to let God be the judge because he is the judge. But it's acknowledging God is the judge and we're not. We are not the capital J judge. Let's fast forward to chapter 38. Finally, God speaks. He lets Job and his friends go back and forth. Finally, in chapter 38, it says, the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, what is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and ye shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off the dimensions? Well, surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it, the earth's foundations? On what were his footings set, or who laid his cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? Basically, God goes on for 2 chapters asking a series of rhetorical questions. Were you there when this world was created. And he goes into detail. Were you there when I set the foundations of the earth? Now, the book of Job is very hard to interpret. You have lots of scholars who debate on what the meaning of Job is. You have scholars who have studied this for years and years and years. So anyone who claims to know exactly what Job means, the main message of Job, we know it's about pain and suffering, but it's a very difficult book to interpret. But we do know a few things, and we know, and as God is responding to Job and his friends here, it's interesting the way God responds, because he doesn't give answers. He doesn't give any answers. What he does is, okay, you guys know it. What he basically says is, okay, you guys think you know it all. You've been going back and forth about theology. About the theology of pain and suffering, theology of sovereignty, theology of righteousness. And you guys think you know. So, if you know, then answer me these questions, which they are not able to answer. And they're rhetorical questions. Bring it back to COVID-19. We have a lot of experts on COVID-19. They gain their research from social media. They read a blog online. The fact is, not even scientists know really much about this coronavirus. Scientists actually don't really know. There are very few certain things in science because the world is always changing. Science always changes. When you hear scientists say this is the absolute truth, you probably don't know what they're talking about because the nature of science is that they're studying something of which there's a vast amount of data. It's really hard to pinpoint absolute truth in science. And COVID-19, there are a lot of things that we don't know. I mean, that's why there's so much debate on what's real or what's not. I mean, the latest debate is on hydroxychloroquine. Have you guys seen that, right? Why aren't they using it? It's a sure thing, because there's one scientist that says it's a sure thing. But that's not true, necessarily. You have other scientists who are like, yeah, well, the data shows blah, blah, blah. And it depends on what data you present and all this stuff. The bottom line is that I'm going off tangent a little bit here, but the point is that we don't know. There's a lot in life we don't know. And when we go to the theology of pain and suffering, there's a reason I believe God doesn't give an answer to Job. He doesn't say, this is why I let these things happen to you. There's nothing in Job that says that. And in our lives too, we may have asked God, if we've experienced a tragedy in our lives, there's nothing that says, or we probably are still wondering, why did that happen to me? Why did I go through that? Now, we may have answers that are true, such as it grew my character, it grew my relationship with God, it grew my dependence on God. That's very true. But is that a sufficient reason for why you had a near-death experience? Or maybe 3 in some people's cases. There's no exact answer. God knows, God is the judge, but we are not. And so as a friend who's going through pain and suffering, for us to try to provide answers that we don't know about, we're playing God in many ways. I think it takes humility to say, I don't know. I don't know. But here are a few suggestions, maybe. We're not called to solve our friends' problems. Sometimes, if you're good with cars and your friend has a problem with a car, it's probably not helpful to be like, man, I feel your pain. Yeah, okay. Well, can you help me out? Yeah, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, you're going to help them out in that way. When we're talking about something that we have no control over, maybe a death of a family member or something, we're experiencing pain and suffering, the only thing we can do is really to be there for him. Let God be the judge. And if God wants to reveal himself to your friend, he will do it. Well, the Lord speaks in Job, and God rebukes Job's friends. He says he not only asks these questions, but he addresses Job's friends in chapter 42, the final chapter of Job. Job replies, after all these lines of questioning, Job replies, he says, "I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted." And he says in verse 8 or 6, "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." And after the Lord had said these things to Job, he says to Eliphaz the Temanite, "I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls, go ahead and sacrifice. Job's going to pray for you, and you'll be forgiven of your sins," basically. God was not happy with his friends. They didn't do what they were supposed to be doing, which is to comfort, to encourage, to lift up, to sympathize, and to point towards hope. There was a story about 10 years ago, a man named Ed Thomas. He was a high school football coach in a little town of Parkersburg, Iowa. About 16 or 1,900 people, this small little town. High school football was a big thing in these small towns. He was a great coach, he was a great leader, a well-respected man in the community. He helped, in May of 2009, he helped the town recover from its tornado. And the team had an 11-1 record that season. Well, in June of the same year, June of 2009, was a former student of Ed Thomas, Coach Ed. His name was Mark Becker. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And one day in June, he goes to practice, and he fires 7 shots at his coach due to his mental illness and kills him on the spot. Imagine Mark Becker's family, how devastated they were at this. Their son, their brother, just committed this horrible act. And they were saddened by it. The Thomas family of the coach, however, they made a public appeal to the family. You imagine in a small town, the Becker family were scorned and hated because of what Mark Becker had done. Thomas family rallied together, and they rallied together in support of the Becker family. They understood that this was not something that was done that was motivated, but a tragedy that happened due to this paranoid schizophrenia. The family that was supposed to be comforted, the Thomas family, ended up being the comforters to the family that should have been accursed. If they can do that, we can do it too. We can be a comforter to our friends when they're going through trials.